I'm thinking about belief, partly in response to a video that Professor Anton was kind enough to share with me, where he talks about belief really eloquently, and partly because of this book that's been sitting on my bookshelf for ages, that I bought years ago and only read half of, called Believing is Seeing, Creating the Culture of Art, which is not really anything to do with belief in the terms that Professor Anton talks about, or that I want to talk about and think about right now. It's really about the kind of creation of the concept of art within Western culture, that particular book. But the title of it strikes me quite a bit, Believing is Seeing. And the reason why it's striking me is because, just syntactically really, that sentence, Believing is Seeing, follows the standard syntactical form for how relationships within conceptual metaphor theory are expressed. Conceptual metaphor theory, very quick potted outline of that, is the idea that the mind is inherently embodied. We have the minds of creatures who evolved to serve particular, to carry out particular kind of bodily functions, to keep us alive and reproducing. Our minds are designed for that task. So our minds, our cognition, is basically follows templates established by bodily experience. And the only reason we can understand abstract experiences which don't present themselves to our senses, which we can't perceive, things like love, truth, justice, probably anything up to 90% is the quotation that I've heard of our discourse, which is made up of that kind of, and our cognition, which is made up of those kind of abstractions. The only way we can organize, understand, structure those abstractions is by the application of conceptual metaphor. So we understand love as if it was a journey down a road, for example. There might be other metaphors as well. And we structure it accordingly, and so on. And those metaphors reveal themselves in our expressions, in our language, or in other kinds of expressions like gesture, which is when I'm doing this gesture to mean in the past. I'm implicitly evoking a metaphor to do with time as being a road that I'm walking along. So we might do it through gesture, or we might do it through a visual image, as little cartoon images of people having ideas tend to have light bulbs above their head, invoking an image to do with inspiration, thought, has something to do with light. So those are the kind of ideas that conceptual metaphor theory and related cognate ideas sits within. And as I say, the standard syntactical form in which those relationships between the source of the metaphor and the target of the metaphor is expressed is in that form, like believing is seeing, love is a journey, time is space, something like that. So believing is seeing, and that one, believing is an abstract concept. I can't touch, taste, engage with belief in any kind of tactile way. So the only way I can understand it is by the application of a metaphor, like in that case, seeing. So to see something is the organization of belief is built around the organization of seeing. So why am I talking about that? Yeah, I guess the reason why I'm thinking about that is because I think there are other understandings of belief which are different from that, or which are more all-embracing than that. And sometimes I think there's a kind of category error going on in terms of how we understand what belief is. I think sometimes we're using a believing is seeing metaphor non-consciously. All this stuff happens non-consciously. But we're using a believing is seeing metaphor non-consciously, when it's perhaps inappropriate, or when it's perhaps actually only a subset of a much larger metaphorical structure. And the way I'm getting into that is thinking back to some stuff that I saw Karen Armstrong, the writer, theologian, I guess, talk about when she was reminding us, I suppose, that the word belief originates in a word which means submission or commitment. And to a certain extent, I guess, well, to an equivalent extent, the idea of belief at some point in the past originates in the idea of commitment and submission. And again, Karen Armstrong in this, I think it was a TED talk, actually, something like that. She reminds us that the word Islam translates literally as submission. So what is this point of submission? So so on the one hand we've got this thing to do with believing is seeing, and on the other thing we've got this idea to do with believing is submission. I think there's a further step involved which makes it a little bit more complicated than I'd hoped, because submission is also an abstract concept. Again, you can't touch, taste, feel, smell, have any kind of physical, sensorial engagement with submission. So submission structures itself according to metaphors also. And although I haven't done a full metaphorical analysis of the idea of submission, some stabs in the dark would be things like metaphors to do with height. Submission is associated with being low down, I think, whereas dominance is associated with being high up. Submission, I think, is to do with having a particular relationship to force, and Leonard Talmy talked quite a bit about force in this regard. That to submit is to give in to a force, whereas perhaps the opposite, like to dominate, might be to exert a force. And there's probably a host of other submissions, other metaphors which organize our understanding of submission. So believing in terms of submission is about those kinds of relationships to do with being low to something high, giving in to a force as opposed to applying a force. And those things should find themselves instantiated in practices associated with belief, practices associated with submission. And I think we certainly do see that, certainly in terms of religious belief, and perhaps other places as well, which I might come on to. A lot of religious belief is about prostrate? I can't remember which is the gland and which is the action. Oh well. A lot of it is to do with making oneself low down in acknowledgement of one's lowly status as opposed to some other higher status, or it's about giving in to a force, feeling oneself compelled as opposed to exerting any kind of force. So belief in Karen Armstrong's use of the word submission seems to be invoking those kinds of actions. I think where these two kind of syntactical, conceptual, metaphor relationships start to come together, the relationship between believing is seeing and believing is submission, is something to do with authority, I think. And I think one of the things to do with submission, this idea of giving into a force, this idea of being low down to something high up, is that seems to be also the characteristics of a relationship to authority. That's the kind of terminology we would use when we're talking about authority. When Newton said, "If I have seen further than other men, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants," he's kind of claiming an elevated position, and the elevated position gives him authority. But that elevated position is also very closely related to visual metaphors. You can see further than other men. So the authority of seeing is starting to play itself out in there. The authority of certain kinds of evidence gathering, certain kinds of what you might call objective evidence gathering processes. One book's going to go back this way. So in the sense that believing is submission, it's submission to authority, and that authority is grounded in different places according to different traditions, and only one of those traditions is seeing the source of authority, seeing being an evidence gathering process, as Newton talks about. There are other kinds of authorities. Biblical authority is kind of the word of, grounded in kind of, I don't know what it's grounded in really, the authority of sacred text. I don't really know what that means really. But there are other kinds of authority, sources, and different kinds of processes play those out. Certainly when I'm in a conversation with someone, I tend to believe what they say, not because I necessarily see what they say, although I might say I see what you mean at various times. I might, but in a sense what I'm doing when I believe what a person is telling me and they believe what I'm telling them is I think we are both submitting to the authority of the protocols of conversation, really, the protocols of polite interpersonal interactions. Okay, I feel like I've rambled across a lot of stuff there, so let me just see if I can find where I've got to with that. So seeing is believing. No, that's the wrong phrase down. If I'm thinking about what this idea of belief is an abstract concept. And one of the dominant ways in which we conceptualize that right now, I think, is by using a largely unconscious belief